As Cowboy, a man who set out from Missouri in the spring of 1850, could be dead before he ever laid eyes on Kansas. Not from a gunfight, not from an outlaw's bullet, from drinking the wrong water at the wrong river crossings. Just like that. Gone before noon. That is the Wild West nobody is selling you in the movies. Welcome to the channel. I'm Clay, and today we are going back to the real American frontier. Not the romanticized one, the one with cholera and stampedes and $30 a month for work that could break every bone in your body. In this video, we are going to walk through exactly why life in the Wild West was one of the most brutal, punishing, and short existences a human being could endure in the 19th century. If you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time. And done. And stick around to the end, because by the time we are done, you will have a serious new appreciation for indoor plumbing. Let's start at the very beginning. Because before you could ever be a cowboy, before you could ride a cattle trail or push your luck in Dodge City, you had to get there first. And getting there was already trying to kill you. The Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Pioneer Trail. These were not romantic paths through open, painted country. Historians have called the Western Overland Trail Network the nation's longest graveyard. And they mean that literally. Estimates suggest that over a 25-year period, up to 65,000 people died along these trails. That works out to roughly a grave every 50 yards from Missouri all the way to Oregon City. Think about that the next time someone romanticizes the covered wagon. Between the 1840s and the 1860s, somewhere around 350 to 400,000 people attempted the 2,000-mile journey west. About 1 in 10 did not survive it. And the way those people died, it was not what you would expect from watching a Western film. The #1 killer on the trail, by a very wide margin, was disease. Cholera above everything else. Caused by bacteria living in contaminated water, cholera could strike a perfectly healthy man after breakfast and have him in the ground by noon. That is not poetic language. That is documented history. Pioneers would draw water from the Platte River in Nebraska, not knowing or not thinking about the fact that dozens of other wagon trains further upstream had been washing their clothes in that same river, emptying waste into it, letting livestock wade through it. The bacteria traveled invisibly in the current, and the people downstream paid for it. Typhoid, dysentery, and measles followed cholera on the list of killers. The medicine kits that pioneers carried west included castor oil, laudanum, opium, patent pills with no real active ingredient, and quinine for malaria. Most of it did almost nothing. And if the disease did not finish you, the well-meaning treatment sometimes accelerated the end. Childbirth on the trail was another quiet catastrophe that rarely makes it into popular history. Virtually every wagon company included pregnant women. Death during delivery was common under those conditions. And a baby born in a covered wagon on the open plains already had very difficult odds before it drew its first breath. Now, firearms were the second leading cause of death on the trail, but not for the reason Hollywood suggests. Native American attacks along the Oregon Trail were, by the historical record, extremely rare. Researchers have estimated that between 1840 and 1860, fewer than 350 emigrants were killed by Native Americans along the entire length of the trail. Meanwhile, accidental gunshots killed far more people. One historian put the ratio at roughly 100 accidental gun deaths for every death from a Native American attack. The reality is that most wagon trains carried enormous quantities of weapons because the settlers were terrified of violence that, more often than not, never came. Tribes along the trail frequently helped the emigrants. They traded with them, guided them, and in many documented cases, kept entire wagon companies from running out of food or losing their animals trying to cross flooded rivers. One 1846 diary recorded that a single 72 wagon train was carrying 260 rifles and pistols, nearly a ton of lead, and over 1,000 pounds of gunpowder. Most of those men had limited experience with firearms. The predictable result was accidental discharges, misfires, and hunting accidents that killed the people the weapons were supposed to protect. River crossings were their own kind of roulette. The Kansas River, the North Platte, the Columbia. Swollen with spring snowmelt, these rivers capsized wagons and drowned livestock in minutes. People were swept under and not recovered. One diary from the period describes watching a member of the party drive his wagon into a rain-swollen creek after dark and simply disappear. The wagon train moved on the next morning. It had no other option. Wagon accidents added to the toll in ways that are easy to underestimate. Covered wagons loaded with a family's entire worldly possessions could weigh over 1,000 pounds. Children fell from the wagon tongue and were crushed beneath the wheels. Adults lost their footing on steep descents. Animals panicked without warning on rough terrain. One diary entry describes the death of an 8-year-old boy in those exact terms, written in the flat, exhausted language of a man who had already witnessed too much loss to linger on any single tragedy. If you survived all of that, if you made it west alive and intact, congratulations. Now the actual work was about to begin. You made it. You need work. You have no land, no trade, no capital. You are a young man in the American West sometime in the 1860s, 70s, or 80s, and you are about to become a cowboy. Let's talk about what that word actually meant in practice. You wake up before 4 in the morning. You eat beans and biscuits from the chuck wagon. Then you spend the next 14 to 16 hours in the saddle, crossing hundreds of miles of open and often punishing terrain, moving a herd of longhorn cattle that does not want to cooperate. You do this every day. You earn around $30 to $40 a month for it. That is a poverty wage for some of the most physically demanding and genuinely dangerous labor a human body can sustain. Then on a typical cattle drive along the Chisholm Trail or the Great Western Cattle Trail, a crew of 10 to 15 drovers was responsible for moving roughly 2,000 head of cattle. The dust those animals generated was constant and consuming. Cowboys who rode drag at the back of the herd spent their entire working day breathing through a bandana, coated in the churned-up earth kicked up by 2,000 animals moving ahead of them. After a full day of that, you were layered in it. You could taste it when you finally lay down to sleep. Sleep was rationed rather than restful. Night guard duty rotated through the crew in 2-hour shifts every single night for the entire length of the drive. After accounting for those rotations, a cowboy on a demanding trail might collect 5 hours of real sleep when conditions were good. That one trail hand wrote that the single worst hardship of the whole cattle drive experience was not the physical danger. It was not the miles or the heat. It was the accumulating, grinding deprivation of sleep, week after week, with no end in sight and no chance to recover. The weather on the Great Plains did not care about human plans or human comfort. Summer temperatures in Texas could reach well over 100 degrees in open country with no shade and no water within reach. Then a blue norther could roll in off the plains within hours, dropping temperatures by 30 or 40 degrees, turning a clear afternoon into a freezing, driving storm that arrived with almost no warning. Cowboys had no real shelter on the open range. A bedroll, a tarpaulin if you were fortunate, and the knowledge that tomorrow was going to be just as hard. Stampedes were one of the defining dangers of cattle drive life, and they deserve more than a passing mention. A herd of 2,000 longhorn cattle in a full run is a force of nature. There is no stopping it from the outside. It destroys whatever is directly in front of it. Stampedes could be triggered by almost anything at all. A crack of thunder, a bolt of lightning in the night, a small animal crossing too close to the lead steers at the wrong moment. When a herd broke in the dark, cowboys rode directly into the chaos, trying to turn the lead animals and bring the herd around in a wide circle to slow the momentum. If a rider went down off his horse in the middle of a stampede, the outcome was not survivable. Lightning killed cowboys with grim and documented regularity on the open plains. One cowboy, writing plainly about his own trail experience, noted that lots of men he had known were killed by lightning on the drive, and that he himself had been knocked off his horse by lightning strikes twice and lived through both times. He considered that outcome fortunate. The open plains offered no elevation variation, no cover of any kind, and the man on horseback was often the highest object in every direction. Getting thrown from a horse was so common on the trail that most experienced hands expected it to happen. The real problem was what came after. Even a minor injury, a broken wrist, a cracked rib, a badly wrenched knee could disable a man for weeks, and there were no doctors reachable, no hospitals, no real medical infrastructure of any kind for most of this period. If a wound became infected, if a break set badly, if something internal went wrong, the nearest qualified help was measured in days of hard riding under circumstances that would only make the injury worse. Many men who survived the initial accident did not survive what followed. For all of this labor and all of this risk, you earned your $30. Then you rode into town. Dodge City, Kansas. The name carried genuine weight across the American continent by the late 1870s, and that reputation was not invented from nothing. The city was established in 1872 along the Arkansas River, connected almost immediately to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. That connection brought explosive growth, and growth on the frontier attracted every possible variety of person, including a meaningful number who had good reasons for leaving wherever they had come from. In its first year, Dodge City had no sheriff and no law enforcement of any kind. What followed was predictable enough. A series of violent deaths and confrontations in those early months gave the city a national reputation almost overnight. Cowboys who died in violent circumstances were buried in a dedicated hilltop cemetery that the locals named Boot Hill. Newspapers from across the country picked up the stories, sensationalized them generously, and Dodge City entered the national imagination as the definitive symbol of frontier lawlessness. There was a joke making the rounds at the time. A man wishing to travel from Wichita to Dodge City asked a friend for a letter of introduction. The friend handed him a double-barreled shotgun and a Colt revolver. That joke landed because a lot of people believed it was essentially accurate. Eventually, the legendary lawman Wyatt Earp and others were brought in to impose some functioning order. Firearms were banned in certain sections of town. A proper jail was built and quickly filled. Dodge City became a more organized place over time, but its reputation had already been fixed in the national consciousness, and Hollywood would spend the following century ensuring it stayed there. The saloons at the center of frontier town life were, in their own way, remarkable institutions. They were the primary social infrastructure of the West. Cowboys, miners, gamblers, merchants, and drifters of every background passed through those doors. Some towns maintained one saloon for every couple hundred residents. In 1883, Livingston, Montana, with a population of just 3,000 people, had 33 operating saloons. Leavenworth, Kansas, with a population of 16,500, had 150. These were not casual recreational spots. They were the center of economic and social life in communities that had almost nothing else. Here is something the Westerns never addressed directly. The whiskey in those saloons was, in many documented cases, not whiskey. Because supply chains on the frontier were unreliable and profit margins were tight, saloon owners routinely diluted and adulterated their alcohol with whatever was available. Documented additives included turpentine, formaldehyde, ammonia, gunpowder, and tobacco juice. Some of these combinations were genuinely poisonous. Men drank them anyway because the alternatives were limited, and the circumstances of their lives were not easy ones. The gambling tables carried their own risks. Arguments over cards escalated into violence with real frequency, and the combination of armed men, enclosed spaces, and substantial alcohol consumption was not an arrangement that encouraged peaceful resolution. A saloon keeper in the frontier West was managing a crisis environment that could come apart without much warning. Disease moved through frontier towns with efficiency. Sanitation was minimal. Clean water was not always available. Physicians were scarce and limited in what they could actually accomplish. Tuberculosis, typhoid, and various other infections circulated through the dense population of cowboys, miners, and railroad workers. If you fell seriously ill in Dodge City in 1878, the available options were not encouraging. And what do you think? Could you have handled that life? The dust, the noise, the risk, the sickness, $30 a month and a glass of something that might have had formaldehyde in it? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. But beneath all of this There is a part of the Wild West story that the mythology was specifically constructed to keep out of the frame. Here is what the movies almost never show you. Underneath the cattle empires, the gold rushes, the gunfighters, and the frontier towns, a catastrophe was already far advanced. One that makes everything else in this video look small by comparison. Before European contact, estimates of the indigenous population of North America range from 5 million at the lowest scholarly assessments to 60 million or more at the highest. By 1900, fewer than 300,000 Native Americans remained. That is not a footnote in the history of the American West. That is one of the largest demographic collapses in the recorded history of human civilization. The single greatest initial cause was disease. Smallpox and other European illnesses arrived on the continent well ahead of most European settlers, carried inland through trade networks and early exploration. Entire nations were functionally depopulated before the first wagon train ever crossed the Missouri. People who had lived in these territories for thousands of years had no immunological defense against diseases they had never encountered. And they died in numbers that reshaped the continent before the frontier period even began. But disease alone does not account for what occurred during the Wild West era itself. By the mid to late 1800s, the surviving indigenous nations were facing sustained military campaigns, forced removal from their lands, and the methodical destruction of the primary resource their survival depended on. The buffalo are a story that requires its own moment. The great herds of the American plains were not just food. They were the foundation of entire civilizations. The animals provided food, clothing, shelter material, and tools. They were central to ceremony and culture and the spiritual life of the nations of the plains in ways that went far beyond the practical. In 1872 alone, over 1.5 million buffalo hides passed through Dodge City. The pace of commercial hunting was industrial in scale. The herds that had once numbered in the tens of millions were functionally gone by the end of the 1870s. The strategy was openly described by some military officers of the period as a way to break the capacity of the Plains nations to survive independently on their own land. The California Gold Rush compressed a similar process into a brutally short span of time. Before 1848, California's indigenous population numbered around 300,000. Within 20 years of the gold rush, roughly 100,000 had perished from disease, forced displacement, and violence carried out by settlers who encountered native people as obstacles to extraction. And then there were the boarding schools. Beginning in 1879 with the opening of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, the federal government pursued a systematic policy of forced cultural assimilation. Children were removed from their families and communities, transported hundreds of miles away, and placed in institutions where they were forbidden to speak their languages, observe their traditions, or use their own names. Anglo names were written on a blackboard. Children were handed a pointer and told to choose one. That name was then written on a piece of paper and hung around their neck. That was their new identity from that moment forward. The philosophy behind this system was stated directly by the founder of Carlisle, Captain Richard Henry Pratt, in a speech delivered in 1892. His words were, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." That policy shaped the treatment of hundreds of thousands of native children across the following decades. Children in these schools faced enforced discipline, forbidding of their culture, and in many documented cases, lasting harm that passed through generations long after the schools themselves were closed. The civilizations that had been displaced were not simple. The Mississippians had built large, complex cities with enormous earthen mounds that were aligned to astronomical events. Dozens of nations across the continent had developed sophisticated systems of agriculture, governance, trade, and knowledge. By the 1800s, many of those civilizations had already been devastated by waves of disease that arrived before the settlers did. What the frontier era completed was the systematic dismantling of what remained. The romance of the Wild West, the cowboy hero, the righteous gunfighter, the wide-open frontier waiting to be claimed, was assembled after the fact. Dime novels in the 1870s and Hollywood films throughout the 20th century took a brutal, chaotic, and morally complicated period of history and pressed it into a clean national myth, a story about freedom and adventure and the triumph of a particular vision of American character. What the Wild West actually was a cholera-ridden trail that killed 1 in 10 of the people who walked it. It was 14 hours a day in the saddle for wages that barely kept you fed. It was toxic whiskey and stampedes in the dark and graves dug so shallow that wolves found them by morning. And underneath all of that, it was the deliberate, systematic dismantling of civilizations that had existed on this land for thousands of years, carried out to make room for a version of America that preferred not to look too carefully at what it was doing to get there. That is the real Wild West, not the sunset and the six-shooter. This. And now that you know the actual history behind the myth, what do you think? Does it change the way you see that era? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if honest, documented history from the American past is what brought you here, subscribe to the channel. We are just getting started.